So then let's say the bracha, and we'll get started. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Amen. Okay, who would like to volunteer to read the paragraph that starts afterwards the bread was bitter?
I will.
Thank you.
Afterwards, the bread was finished by them, and again they began to cry for food. After that, it became night, and they lay there. In the morning again, they did not have what to eat, and they wailed and they cried. Meanwhile, again came a beggar who was deaf. They began to speak to him, and he showed them with his hands and said to them that he could not hear. And he also gave them bread to eat and started to go away from them. They also wanted that he should take them with him, but he did not want. And he also blessed them and that they should be like him. And he also left them bread and went away. What do you mean they should be like him? He's a deaf beggar. That's not a good role model.
No. But what's the feature of his behavior? He's a beggar.
Well, he gave them bread.
Right.
But
well,
yeah.
There's a certain irony there, right? A beggar,
yeah, but I don't think our feeling toward these beggars is they're kind of like good Samaritans. They're not to be looked down upon, are they?
I think you're right. That's one thing that is unusual about them. But the unusual thing about them that strikes me is that though they are beggars, they have the wherewithal to support others. You wouldn't think that a beggar would be in the position to give food or whatever to anybody else. They're beggars. So we're already talking about something that is not magical, but ironic.
I think it's more connected with Christianity. This image of may the meek inherit the earth kind of thing.
Well, that is a Christian value.
And how about a Buddhist monk who goes begging for food?
Well, it's there too.
But the question is, if you're talking about the meek inheriting the earth, or a Buddhist monk who goes around beseeching alms, you wouldn't say that they were in position to give something material to others themselves.
Well, what we say the Buddhist monk gives people the opportunity to give.
Yes, that's more like what I think comes out of the Jewish tradition. The idea of a beggar, schnorrer is a beggar with a PhD. And you think of the Sholem Aleichem story, which is repeated in Fiddler on the Roof, at the beginning of the musical. The Nachum, the beggar, cries out, "Alms for the poor, alms for the poor." And some average person says, "Here, Nachum, here's a kopek." Nachum says, "1 kopek? Last week you gave me 2 kopeks." "Well, I've had a bad week." "So if you had a bad week, why should I suffer?"
I remember that. We talked about this before, about the beggar giving the giver the opportunity to do a good deed.
Yes. So really the power relationship is inverted, which is carried through in the idea that the beggars we're talking about here have material, I don't know if you can exactly say wealth, but wherewithal, which enables them to be donors. There is an irony here that the beggars are in the position of being donors to other people. So you have to ask yourself the question, what is it that they have that enables them to be donors? What donors in what sense? Uh, we're meant to understand that there is a simple sense in which they are donors in terms of giving something of substance, bread, for example. But how is it that they have bread if they're beggars? What's the quality or the functionality behind their being in a position, although they are recognized as beggars, to be donors as well? What is
Well,
it?
there's one thing about the Buddhist monks is they're not supposed to store any food, and whatever they can't immediately use themselves, they're supposed to give to other people, other monks. But the other thing is, I read about a study where they looked at people's compassion, like rich people's compassion versus poor people's compassion for the poor. And they found that there was a difference and the poor people were more compassionate. But then they showed them a movie of people suffering. And didn't take very much for the rich people to become compassionate, to care more about the poor.
That's interesting. So, how do you explain that, Kim? What's
Well,
what?
you forget, but then you'll remember.
Okay, what what is it that you forget? If you're a rich person,
You forget what it is to suffer, to be without. But the beggars are closer to that because they experience that every day.
well, you would think that they are very close to that experience. How can they be both beggars and givers? You know, if you think of these stories of people who are themselves poor, but who are able nonetheless to find some uh, wherewithal to help others who are similarly poor. Now,
In Mexico City, there was a beggar woman with a little baby, but you really don't know how young the baby is because they may be malnutritioned, whatever. But so I gave her some money, and then I followed her, and she went into the church. She was at the steps of a church. She went into the church and put the money in the box.
Oh man.
yes,
And
that's a good
it
example.
was quite something. It really affected me that here I thought I would be giving money so she could give some food for her kid.
Well, see that's a very interesting point because somehow she thought that making this donation to help others was going to help her her family.
Well, that seems like an assumption.
It is an
Maybe,
assumption.
I mean, there would be other possibilities that she just thought that this was her love, the
Well, and
church.
it's also about God's providence. You know, if you are a person who gives out of the little that you have, that is a pretty positive thing and may be rewarded.
Yeah, we've talked about that. How in Christianity, it's the idea of God will take care of you.
Right. So let's look at this here.
Okay.
These beggars who are let's assume that they actually are beggars. They look like beggars, they act like beggars, they have little in the way of material possessions, but they are in a position to give bread to others. So what kind of bread are we talking about? What is it that the beggars are able to give since they are actual beggars and don't have anything? So what?
It strikes me that the children cry and cry and cry, and they're the only ones who come. So they are the ones who are listening and who answer cries for help, which I think
So
is angels. They're angels.
well, it depends on what you mean by angels. But yeah, I mean, these are not necessarily um, the creatures we often think of as angels who are able to fly around and so on and so forth. But angels, I mean, how can a person be an angel? What is it that would qualify a person as being called an angel, even though they have nothing?
They they respond when invited, when there's a need for help.
Yeah, and where does their capability to respond come from? Because they're not they may be responding in a physical way, or giving bread, but they don't have bread. So what kind of bread is it that they're giving?
Attention.
Can you think of any examples?
Yeah, when the Israelites are in the desert, they
Yes,
need food, and God gives them manna.
Mhm.
that's right, which is a total gift. And it's not as if the Israelites have some special um, repository of manna that they can draw upon. The manna is a gift from God. And one of the things to bear in mind here is that even though you are poor, you may not have uh, the, the wherewithal to give actual bread. You are still in the position where you can be helpful to other people. And that can even be in the sense of providing sustenance for other people. I When I think about this, I often think about the stories that come out of the death camps of people who
Right.
have next to nothing, maybe a tiny piece of bread and some potato soup, um, but who nonetheless share what they have, even though it's next to nothing.
There was a point in there was a second movie made, the making of Schindler's List,
Uh huh.
and I think it was in there where the people in the concentration camp, when they were let out, noticed one of the guards didn't have any boots and gave the guard their boots.
That's quite an amazing idea.
Yeah.
Uh, where does that impulse come from? I mean,
Loving
I
kindness.
think it's a great example. But if you're a former inmate in Auschwitz and you come across some boots, what would occasion you to give those boots to one of the former guards?
Loving kindness.
Yeah, something something that surmounts the actuality of physical depredation, and you can feel the need of somebody else, despite the fact that they may have been cruel, they may have been um, uh, immoral. Somehow, for some people, in some circumstances, they somehow overcome that.
I mean, that was kind of the thing about Franco, wasn't it? That he didn't let the anger. I mean, anger could have so easily just eaten him up,
Yes, although
but he went
Victor
to another
Frankl,
place.
well, but he's a very good example because although he was able to somehow surmount the feelings of anger, of resentment, etc., that he quite naturally would have had, they continued, those feelings continued to plague him throughout the rest of his life, and eventually he committed suicide. There were, he, he's an interesting example because he was able to hold out and maintain his humanity under terrible conditions, but we was not ever able to solve the existence of those feelings of resentment or hate.
Do you know that the suicide wasn't the result of some great pain or sickness?
No, he just, as I understand it, um, he had what? He no longer had the capability of suppressing the anger or
Hmm.
the hatred. I mean,
Yeah, I
think,
didn't
think
know
about
that. I think you've mentioned that, but I didn't remember
think
that.
about it this way: um, most of us, when we're in a position of having been abused by somebody else, can, for some period of time, act uh, in a way that overcomes the impact of the abuse. We can hold out and maintain our humanity for a certain amount of time, but quite often that's not uh, a permanent state of being. Eventually, uh, the we're unable to continue to do that because it takes an unusual amount of strength and dedication to do that. It's constant to maintain the sense of being a human being in the face of having been abused is not an easy thing to do. It's not like you just decide to do it. Now you're set on a different course, and that's the story. It's a constant struggle to maintain that uh, uh, charitable position. And we human beings are not necessarily able to do that ad infinitum. We can sometimes run out of the patience or the lovingness, loving kindness, or the charity that we feel for somebody who had abused us or had hurt us. Um, it would be a whole lot easier if we could just make the decision once and then that was it. That set our course. But it's a constant struggle. And for that reason, um, the story demonstrates how close together resentment and charity, or resentment and generosity, are, and how difficult it is to maintain that distinction. And that is a struggle for us to do. We try to maintain it, but often we get tired and we just can't do it anymore. So here's the question: how is it? I mean, the story here is making this point that being a beggar and being a giver are very close together. That really we go back and forth. There's a fine line between uh, being a beggar who has nothing and a beggar who can nonetheless still give something of value to other people. But you can imagine how difficult that is to maintain, that it's done at a great cost. And as human beings, we are um, easily, well, not easily, it's very difficult to maintain that kind of distinction. So eventually, we may succumb to those feelings of anger and resentment and so on, because we just don't have it in us to be permanently uh, uh, to permanently overcome them. You get tired when there's a constant uh, 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 battle to maintain your humanity. The stories of uh, the, the the mitzvot, the people engaged in the concentration camps, are very illuminating in this way. The, there were those who were able to maintain the stance of overcoming their sense of loss or their anger or their resentment, and there were those who could do it for a time, but ultimately could not continue to do it. They just get worn out. If you think about it, I don't know of your experience, but certainly can talk about my own experience. There are many times when I make a resolution to be kind about something that normally I would be upset or angry or resentful about, and I can do it for a time, but it's not easy to do it without end. And that is one of our um, limitations as human beings. So I think that the story about the beggars is about how being a beggar is on this point of balance. You can imagine how unhappy, how resentful, how angry somebody who is a beggar can be, even though they may struggle for a time to overcome that and do overcome it for a period of time, and then discover that they are depleted and they don't have that reserve anymore. So one example of this, years ago, when there were the riots in Watts, and people tried to explain how come all of a sudden there were these riots. People, what happened that tipped the balance in that direction? And we've seen that increasingly in recent years in Ferguson or in other places where it seems that all of a sudden, seemingly out of the blue, uh, people who had been quiescent or at least repressed become, their anger somehow takes over. What was the factor that led them to to riot or to attack police officers or other people even in their own community? And I think that what we're getting here in this story is that the position of trying to overcome abuse is not an easy position to hold on to. It's like the scales where you have two plates or whatever you might call them that you can put um, something on, and you can balance the scale. But when you think about it, that's a constant process because there's always a new um, weight that's added. You have to continually add more weight on the other side, and you're constantly on the tip. It's not all that hard when you think about it for the balance to go out of kilter. So I mean, I don't think that it's unusual for people to be uh, for them to overcome resentment or abuse or anger. I don't think it's usual for that to be a permanent stance. It's constantly, on the contrary, um, a position of being um, easily skewed to one side or the other. And if we are ourselves trying to maintain a more charitable position, then we're constantly adjusting the scale. And that may last for a certain period of time, maybe even a long period of time, but eventually we might lose the ability or the patience to continue to do that. It becomes sort of a never-ending process of having to adjust the scale. Yeah, Judith.
It seems that if you're carrying this sack of disappointment and sadness and whatever it is, the sack of stones, it also becomes more difficult to carry it as we get older because we don't have the strength we had when we were younger. And if we can't dispose of these stones or these disappointments or anger, then that's really going to weigh us down more and more as we get older and older.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and which is a statement about human limitation. It's not as if when we try to overcome these feelings of resentment or anger or whatever, that somehow we come to a comfortable point where the system is in balance and remains in balance. You know, it's I mean, a lot of times I think of the terrarium and how very delicate the balance in the ecosystem is. And once it goes out of whack a little bit, you are now constantly adjusting and adjusting and adjusting in order to reestablish that sense of balance. And that's very hard to do. And although theoretically you can do it, in actuality, when you try to rebalance the scale, rebalance the factors in the system, it's very difficult to add exactly the right amount of the right chemical or what have you. We might add just a little teeny bit too much, or just not quite enough. And so the balance is not restored. The way the story presents the position of the beggar is that they are living on the knife's edge of a balance. And that is hard to maintain ad infinitum. That's, it would be nice if that were not the case. But think about those folks who have a reputation for being kind, for being able to surmount whatever challenges they have in terms of their wherewithal. I think of Albert Schweitzer, for example, who has had the reputation of being able to somehow surmount the usual kinds of factors that would take us off course. If there's one person like Albert Schweitzer, what it shows us is that there's a theoretical position where it's possible for human beings to overcome these negative feelings, but it's so rare that it's almost unkind to expect any of us to do that indefinitely. What makes somebody like Albert Schweitzer so remarkable is that somehow he seemed to be able to overcome this this constant efforts to reestablish balance, and was able to continue to do this after most people would have given up or would have decided that they had failed. I think Frankl was an example of that he had reached his limit and was no longer able to continue this process of balancing and rebalancing the factors in his life. So, I think of issues in my family and many families that I know where people are deeply hurt by what others in the group do. And even though they have the impulse to feel charitable towards whoever hurt them, eventually it's very understandable that they may no longer be able to do that. People just, as Judith was indicating, they get tired. They don't have the strength to do it anymore. And, so if we're looking at these beggars, what's really interesting, it seems to me, is that they are able to help to restore the balance in the lives of these other people who they help by giving bread to and so forth. But it's a constant process. I don't think we can just sort of assume that it moves forward in an equitable kind of way. So for us who are trying to explore the question of what it means to grow spiritually, one of the great stumbling blocks is our misunderstanding that somehow we're able to reach a stage where this problem of balancing has been solved and the balance has been restored. And now we can move past that. I don't think that's the way it goes. I think even as we are studying, even as we are exploring new directions in our lives, there is a constant challenge to whatever new set point of balance we may achieve at any one particular time. And we're constantly facing the challenge of having to restore that balance again and again and again. And what is I think, what becomes a great stumbling block for many of us, maybe even all of us to some degree, unless you're Albert Schweitzer, is that there is a frustration that builds up, that there's no end to this process of having to balance again and again and again the position we achieve in trying to develop certain attributes like charity, like forgiveness, and so on and so forth, that constantly there are challenges to that. And, maybe we think at some point it becomes unfair to continually have to engage in this process. When do we ever get to the point in our lives where we have accomplished finding a point of balance, and now that process is over? We've gotten there. We've achieved it. I don't think that's how it works. I think if once we solve one aspect of that problem, there's something else that pops up as a new challenge to that point of balance. And for that reason, I think sometimes we get tired of having to continually struggle with this. And in a way, you kind of understand, you put in all your effort to try to develop a new position or a new understanding, and it's not like the challenge goes away. It just takes a different form. And we are constantly challenged by these new factors. And we might even get angry about that. When does it end? When do we get to the end of the process where we can say, okay, now I've achieved the right balance of things in my life? Well, my suspicion is we don't ever really reach such a position.
There's also a society, how the society is about taking care of the poor. And during the Renaissance, it was the role of the community to feed the prisoners. Prisoners would be given no food or wine, which is really diluted. It was water with a little wine in it.
Yeah.
And all their food would come from the society. People would bring them food. And then also, I understand that there was a lot more private charity, let's say 100 years ago, than now, because we have so much more welfare.
Well, that's interesting. I don't think I was aware of that, but it makes a certain kind of sense. I mean, there's always, for many years now, it's been a debate about whether or not private charity is a good thing. In the left, certain elements of the left argue that private charity undermines the obligation of a society to take care of people. So it's discouraged.
Yeah.
So if you look at it from that point of view, it's very, or ironic at least, that the impulse to be charitable is not seen as fully laudatory. That there's a side of it which is counterproductive.
And we also have that concept of that you're enabling someone to continue to not work and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's very.
And that's probably a modern term. I mean, that maybe that never, I don't know.
That's doing it in excess. And when I've studied Mussar before, one of the things we always looked at was the trait, and then an excess of the trait. You can always be too humble or too giving or too, and that's there's excess on both ends. I find this discussion really amazing because I'm currently this morning writing a piece for Saging International's curriculum that's called Repairing Relationships. And I already have some exercises for that, which I didn't create. I'm creating the wording of this curriculum. But this is the second time. You're psychic, Kerry. because this is the second time you've helped me with my writing on the curriculum.
Well,
So
glad
thank
to be helpful, Judith.
Well, actually, I wrote something today because someone in the neighborhood had their car broken into, and so he started ranting and raving about the riffraff and the homeless and so forth. And then I found an article that it was not actually the homeless actually do less crimes than those with homes. And I sent something out about that. This was in Venice, California, this article. But also, we're engaged in a project now at the Zen Temple of creating bags that will be given to the homeless. We're doing 200 bags a month. That's our goal, and we're going to be putting these together in a week. So I've been thinking about the homeless and the fact they don't get any food from Friday through Sunday. So these bags with food and water will be given to them. But
Very interesting. There is something that uh, I think it's still, relatively speaking, a small number of people who do it. But I do know of people who put together uh, bags of food or other essential items to give out to people as they are driving around, and they pass folks who are standing on the street corner who are begging for a meal or whatever it is.
yeah.
And they carry these bags of food and other sundries with them to hand out through their car window.
Yeah, we're doing it through some organization, but I know about that too. That's great.
Yeah, and I look at that and I say, uh, it's a wonderful thing that people do that. But I've also seen cartoons that are meant to make fun of these kinds of activities. As one I saw about somebody who wants a franchise for standing on the corner uh, and receiving alms from people who are driving around. Are there any more of those franchises left? That's a little cynical, but I think that's part of something that we're not talking about yet, which is the resentment that sometimes we feel towards the recipient of alms. Um, when somebody stands out on the street corner and is begging for food, there's some of us who react in a very negative way. You shouldn't give money to somebody on the street who's begging for money. But the way I look at it is, if somebody's doing that, they've already hit a low point and are willing to be vulnerable about the position that they're in. It's a little difficult to criticize them in the context of their willingness to, I don't know, this may be an over too strong a term, but to abase themselves by publicly taking the stance saying that I'm in need, that I am poor, I don't have anything, and I'm willing to take whatever gift you will bestow upon me, not because I'm worthy or not worthy, but because I just don't have any alternative. So there's lots of conflicting impulses in all this. And I look at this from the standpoint of the cynical view the Torah expresses, that the poor will always be with us. I think the idea being that this problem of people being poor or being without the wherewithal they need to live is not something that is going to find some permanent solution, that we are going to have to continually uh, try to reestablish balance in society and between ourselves and other people who are in need. And it doesn't go away. I think we all would love it if it were something that could disappear. It could be something that would be solved permanently. But maybe that's not the nature of life. Maybe the nature of life is to face these challenges constantly, no matter how well intended our efforts may be to improve the situation. And we're in the position of Viktor Frankl, who got tired of having to continually engage in this without any seeming solution that was making its appearance. I wish that, well, I guess I wish that it could be done differently, but I don't think that that is the way things work. It's why we have to continually rededicate ourselves over and over again to dealing with the challenges to balance, to I won't say prosperity, but to adequacy. And there's somehow no way permanently around them, which I'm sure makes a lot of people very frustrated. I think we all get a little frustrated that way. So I'm thinking that we got through the paragraph. And one thing I think perhaps we ought to pay attention to before we wind up our discussion today. At the end of the paragraph that we were just reading, wait a minute, the text just get moved?
Kim.
I think we just lost our position on the sheet.
Kim, you're muted.
Sorry?
Kim is muted, I was telling you.
Oh,
Move it up a little bit, Kim. No, the other way.
no. There's the line that Hashem,
Oh, that's the other.
God, is constantly watching over these folks. You know, we're past where we were reading
Yes.
before.
The other way, Kim.
Down. Oh, this is, let's see.
We haven't read this yet.
Nope, the other
No.
way. 288. 298.
298, yeah.
There we
There
go.
we go.
There it is at the top. Hashem.
Yeah, just a little bit more in that direction. Okay, good. So,
There it is.
yeah. So what is God's role in this situation? I mean, think about there being poor people, people who are suffering, who are without the wherewithal to sustain life. What is God's role in this? I mean, does God have any responsibility to help take care of these people? what's being suggested here.
That she is watching, listening, and
Yes.
sending help.
Yeah, and what is it that God expects from us?
I think only to be the best we can be, no more.
I agree with you, but what does that consist of?
Mussar.
That's what I was going to say.
Well,
We're trying for Mussar.
I think that that's true. I mean, God watching over them is us watching over them. You know, we are God's eyes and ears and so forth. So I think that is the challenge that we have to face. That we're trying to develop ourselves spiritually, ethically, and so forth. It's not in the vacuum. It's in the context of recognizing our responsibility as children of God in the process of God watching over humankind, watching over God's creation. We are the ones whose eyes help us to see what it is that's actually going on. In an interesting sort of way, it's the very challenging position of recognizing that our reaction to the poverty or the deprivation that surround us is not just about a human feeling of compassion or what have you, but that it comes out of recognizing that we ourselves are under obligation to act as God's hands, if you want to say that. You know, our job is not just to feel compassion, but to feel divine obligation. And that's something that's a huge responsibility. You can't just say, "Oh well." There is a level, a cosmic level of obligation that we incur because we ourselves are beggars, and we know what it is to be a beggar. And if you know what it is to be a beggar, how can you deny to others who are beggars what it is that we are able to do?
Yeah,
However,
I need to go now.
Yeah, we're at the end of our session.
But I am looking up about Frankel, and it says that he died of heart failure. Two different websites.
Well, heart failure is it's not taking poison or something, but it's
So maybe they're nice about it, but I don't see anything. I Googled,
Yeah.
committed suicide, don't find anything on that.
no, perhaps I'm wrong. Could be.
So I'm curious.
You can stop taking your medicine. That's one way of doing it.
Well, that's true. You know, if it's congestive heart failure, which I have, there's all sorts of stuff you need to be doing to maintain
Yeah.
a life, and if you don't do them, that's what you die of.
But I'm
All right.
interested. I'm interested in that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all very much, and
next week.
we'll meet again next week.
Okay.